Tesla and Volvo announced last week that they're suspending some of their production in Europe due to a shortage of supplies that was caused by shipping disruptions near the Red Sea and Suez Canal because of this threat of attack from the Houthi militants in Yemen. So today, let's dig deeper into this and find out how long the shutdowns will occur, what supplies are being impacted, and what does this mean to Tesla stock and goals. We've got Jeff Lutz joining us. Jeff is a supply chain executive at multiple Fortune 100 companies. Welcome, Jeff.
Yeah, great to be with you, Herbert. This one's right in my wheelhouse. Let's go through it.
You've run some big factories. You worked at one of the Fortune 100's even bigger companies, by the way, and you've managed their supply chain, and this has happened to you in the past. So curious to see what you think. This happened just this morning. So on January 15th, approximately 4 p.m., Iranian-backed Houthi militants fired an anti-ship ballistic missile, struck this Gibraltar Eagle ship, container ship. Luckily, the ship has reported no injuries or significant damage, and is continuing its journey. I guess what happened here was the missile failed in flight and impacted on land. There are no injuries or damage reported, but this is what's happening. So there's this missiles being fired. What do you know about this? And let's tell me more about before we play this other video.
Let me give the quick backdrop. When you're designing a supply chain, there's many vectors and variables that you're designing for. And one of the things you are thinking about is shipping lanes, air, freight, train, a rail, we call it, air, rail, shipping. You're thinking about all those supply lanes, inbound, outbound, and you're thinking about redundancy. You could have a natural disaster, for example. Let's say there's a typhoon on one coast in Asia or a hurricane here, or you are thinking about, are there issues related, from a geopolitical risk, from a war perspective? So you're thinking along a number of different lines, and these things happen. And what great supply chains do is they have redundancy set up is the best they can. Now, when you're building in redundancy, you have to be careful to not do it. You can't do it at the expense of, just driving your cost structure through the roof. But what you like to do is you like to get suppliers that can have, the geographical redundancy. You'd want to have, if you think about your various inbound and outbound lanes, you want to figure out, do you have redundant paths and so forth. So that's what Tesla's been doing. Obviously, they're getting hit here. You've got the Red Sea, which is, there's basically missiles flying overhead. You don't want to put your supply chain partners, freight partners, you don't want to put human lives at risk. Okay, that's one of the things you really honestly don't want to violate from a supply chain perspective, is putting human lives at risk. So what's happening here in the setup here for the Red Sea, what's happening is there's basically rerouting that's occurring, and that rerouting is taking probably the thing that is under most constraint, which are the actual shipping containers themselves, and it's putting them on water longer. When they're on water longer, they're in greater supply, and there's not enough supply of them as there was 3 weeks ago or 2 months ago. So that's causing a bit of a disruption. What that's doing, there's a couple of things happening. One is there's time being added to getting product from one port to the other. In some lanes, it's as much as 10 days. Some it may be a little bit longer, depending where it's going. So you got a time element that you've got to deal with, and then you've got a cost element because you've got these containers on the water longer. So they're not unloading, refilling, and moving. And they're not, so you need more of them. Basically to get the product, the demand for the product is still there. So you got those two things happening, and that puts us where we are today.
We're going to watch a video explaining more what happened, and then shortly we're going to actually go and find out what happened to Tesla. How is this going to impact Tesla specifically? So let's watch this.
On with us in recent weeks, because you're keeping a micro track of the impact of what's playing out in the Red Sea. The latest from Flexport's perspective, please.
Well, the biggest thing here is obviously the impact for customers, for companies shipping cargoes, the impact on price, transit time as well. You mentioned Tesla having issues getting parts to manufacture goods. I think you're going to see that across a huge swath of companies, especially in Europe, but also in the East Coast. So there's delays, and then two is the price. The price of ocean freight has gone from, well, it's gone up about 4x, and not just from Asia to Europe, even from Asia to the US on the West Coast, where you would think it's not, from China to the West Coast of the United States shouldn't be impacted by the Suez on the surface, and yet it is. Prices have gone up about 3x, and this is partially because ships have been pulled off of that trade lane to provide the extra capacity needed to go from Asia to Europe because of the longer way around. It's also because all of these trades depend on the same asset, which is containers. And if there's not enough containers, then you're going to have to pay more to, for the ones that there are. And so you got a supply and demand dynamic that's driving up the costs of everything.
Mm-hmm. So that's what I was just saying. You got the two dynamics of time and then container supply that's driving up the cost. Now, in terms of Tesla and what this means for Tesla, number one, Tesla doesn't pay daily spot pricing for shipping unless they're setting up a brand new part with a brand new service provider. In general, they have various supply partners that are already contracted over long-term contracts. So when these spikes occur, the real costs to these companies go up, and they do in some cases want to pass it on to the OEM, but Tesla's got contract pricing in place. So the key here is this conflict needs to end quickly, because no partner, you just can't, as the OEM, you just can't go back to your supply partner and say, well, just shove it up, where indefinitely. You've got to go figure this out. In the short term, you want them to figure it out. You want them to get creative. But in the long term, you want a fair relationship between partners. So the bottom line is this needs to get resolved quickly. What it did for Tesla, what it introduced, that time delay being on water longer, introduced, what we're going to see, which is basically this January 29th to February 11th. And by the way, that's, right around, Chinese New Year as well. So you're going to have outbound freight affected on the China side already during that period. So a little bit of a disruptive period for Tesla, but we'll listen to a little bit more, and I'll kind of give you my take on what I think it means in terms of impact.
To kind of track the movement of those containers through the ships. We talked about Tesla as the example at the top of this show, Ryan, but in simple terms, the parts and components they need to feed the assembly lines are not getting through. So they've halted production. Do you have any customer examples where something similar has happened, or any specific industries that have a micro hit from what's happening in the Red Sea?
Well, it's across the board, and anything that's manufacturing related, where you're really depending on these inbound parts to then run an assembly line, is going to be hit by that. And then the other big thing you see is manufacturing that's done in ports that are no longer getting the same service level. So a really good example of this is we have a company that makes apparel in Jordan. And Jordan's port, of course, is on the Red Sea at Aqaba. And the carriers that would often stop there on the way through the Suez are not going through there at all. And Jordan has lost most of the ocean capacity that was serving. And so this customer, we're scrambling on their behalf, starting to find alternate routes, whether that's air freight or some of it's going to get trucked over to Dubai and put on a ship there. So
here's the point. Tesla, of course, grabbed the headline because Tesla went out there and said, look, there's going to be, meaningful disruption. And they advised, that that's going to happen. Every company that's building, and this is what Ryan said. Ryan's very experienced. So Ryan runs a company, Flexport, that manages logistics, the planning aspects of it, kind of the software. There's software, machine learning aspects of it. So they're a pretty high tech company, Flexport Global, and he's definitely tied in. When these situations happen, so he's a good resource, and his team is a good resource. But anyway, bottom line is Tesla, of course, grabbed all the headlines with this because the media loves to, as soon as they put Tesla in the headline. By the way, I think Al Root told us, who's a writer for Barron's, is basically if I put Tesla in the headlines versus another car manufacturer, it's going to get 100x more impressions. So Tesla grabbed the headline, but Ryan will tell you right there that basically anybody building anything that's dependent on ocean freight of stuff made in China to do final assembly, for example, in Europe, or the United States, they're going to be impacted. So that's the situation. In terms of some people are asking, well, which components do we know which components are involved? Usually what you put on onto shipping freight is you put very high mass objects and things that you can plan over a long duration. It's very important. This is one of the important things. Tesla will probably do much better than others for this one, very important reason. Tesla builds just one model, right? In Berlin. Now there's different variants of the Model Y, but they basically build one model of the product. That's massively helpful for Tesla versus, if you're a company like a BYD wasn't set up manufacturing yet, but the other auto companies that have multiple models to fulfill their volume, whereas Tesla is doing it with one. In this situation, when you minimize complexity on the OEM or the receiving side, you're going to be in better shape to work through these supply disruptions and challenges. So what's on those ships, I think Alexander did some homework on it as well, reading some German media. So batteries, battery packs will be on that ship. But really, the answer to that question from a supply chain design perspective is one of the things you measure localization. And what localization is you have your core factory in the center. And what you want to do is you want to drive basically in driving vicinity, you want to get as much of the product sourced locally as possible. So when situations like this happen, you're not disrupted from air and from rail and from ocean, but B, the cost, the logistics side of it, and the response side from a supplier perspective. At the same time, you want that geographical redundancy. So what Tesla does in their supply chain is they're driving for these global partners. And what these global partners do, it could be the best, stamping supplier that they know of, or the best spring supplier that they know of. And what they'll do is they'll go to that supplier and say, look, I know you're supplying me in Fremont, or maybe it's a Shanghai supplier. Hey, I know you're supplying me in Shanghai, but I want you to scale. I know you're only doing China, but I want you to figure out how to do Mexico. I want you to figure out how to do Berlin, and then set up multiple manufacturing locations to serve them. So a lot of words there, but I think the point is what components are being affected. Basically, it's everything that's not localized in Berlin. I think that's a fairly high number at this point. And then over time, the Berlin manufacturing team and supply chain team around Berlin is going to take that localization number and drive it up. But that's what's affected. In terms of what this means, Berlin, if we look at the last quarter, I believe they were delivering about 50,000 vehicles. So on a 75-day production calendar, you leave the last 2 weeks for any kind of outbound distribution to get to the customer. You're talking about 600 units a day. So if you've got a 10-day issue you're dealing with, 10 or 11, 12-day issue, you're talking about 6,000, maybe up to 7,000 units that could be impacted. Now, I would like to think that from the last quarter to this quarter, that Tesla kicked up their capacity a little bit in Berlin, so that number could be higher, but their recovery rate could be a little bit higher. So what companies do in this situation is they try to take that 14 or 15 last days of the quarter, and they try to squeeze it down to 12 or 13, and they try to do expedites. So when these situations happen like this all the time, there's supply disruption all the time, but usually it's hours and maybe a day or two, not for 2 weeks. So what Tesla will try to do, they'll try to make a couple days up just with, end of the quarter, maybe some expedites. What I think the bigger thing that they can do is when you have another factory like Shanghai can run at probably around 3,500 to 4,000 units a day. So you take that 6,000 to 7,000 unit shortfall. Could we get another ship out of Shanghai? That's the other thing. Can they figure out how to schedule that and get that going? That could eat into 2/3 of this delay. So there's a number of moving parts for Tesla to manage. I imagine that, number one, they've rerouted ships. They have the delay in. If there's parts that they can get, through rail, for example, rail's another inexpensive approach. They're probably switching some stuff to rail because we don't know how long this conflict's going to happen for. So you have to plan for the window you have right now, and you have to put kind of the issue on, you got to put it on a hand, to use a poker term, and say, how long is this going to last? So they're planning for this issue. They're planning for how long this may take and maybe switching up partners and approaches. And then finally, you have Shanghai, which has this outsized capacity versus Berlin is much smaller. A day and a half or so extra out of Shanghai could make up a lot of this. So they may not make up all of it, but I don't think it's going to be a meaningful issue for the quarter.
Yeah.
Again,
so much,
sorry, I should say that.
Yeah.
Unless it extends beyond this 11-day, which I don't think it will, because I think they've rerouted. So the 11 days was the time for them to just reroute and get new continuous supply in. But if for some reason, if rerouted ships started getting godforsaken hit or something, well, then all bets are off. But I think this is a very small impact to Tesla.
This is what I've been wanting to hear. Thank you so much, Jeff. You've informed us so much. So I'm going to repeat some things that you just did say already, but this article didn't just, they would put Tesla right at the front. Tesla and Volvo pause productions in Europe, the Red Sea shipping crisis. This is, just an example of a container ship moving through the Suez Canal. And then here they say that Tesla, in a gigafactory in Berlin, they did not specify which components, but Volvo said, Volvo's owned by the Chinese firm Geely, that's going to be delayed, and they said it was the delayed delivery of gearboxes. Alexandra was reading the German press, and she says, take this information with a grain of salt. And she did a little poll. What do you think these ships were taking? It's just regular people, and I think most people said various supplies was what you're saying. And in the article, it said BYD batteries, but you're still saying it's more. It's
not one thing.
BYD.
It's multiple things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. All right. Wonderful. So thank you so much, Jeff. Again, your background in this explains so much. The the long-term contracts that Tesla already has. They're not spot pricing. That it's going to be adjusted by different factories, because every time you do it with your factories, you've always built in contingencies because things like this happen. So let's hope this is short. Yeah.
Yeah. Short-term time offset, maybe a 3 to 4 impact in container costs, which will, for companies without spot pricing, it's going to be an issue. So time delay, little bit of issue with spot pricing. Want this to be a short, contained issue. Really importance of localizing your supply chain. Really important to have geographical redundancy and supply-based redundancy. I think Tesla does a very good job at this. And they've got a factory in Shanghai with significantly more capacity that can probably help with this offset. And then maybe they squeeze a few days in Berlin and kind of close most of the gap.
Okay. I think we're very confident Tesla is very well managed, but if they're not, they should hire you, Jeff.
No, they don't need
it
me.
Out there in case
they've got a great team.
They got a great team. Okay. Thank you so much, Jeff. Follow him on X at the Jeff Lutz. Thanks, everybody. I've created a website that is the most comprehensive resource for the Tesla investor. Please check it out. Simply go to my website at herbertong.com.